The railroad ties had gone silver with weather, the way old wood does when it stops fighting the elements and simply accepts them. The spikes holding them to the ground had bled rust into the wood grain, leaving dark streaks like old wounds that had healed wrong. And the old man walked between the rails the way a person walks a path worn into grass, not because it was easy, but because something had made it and it went somewhere, and that was enough. Eldon Pruitt was 74 years old. He walked slowly, and he knew it, and he had stopped being embarrassed about it somewhere around the third day out of Billings. His knees told him their opinion of gravel roadbeds every quarter mile or so, and he listened to them the way he had learned to listen to machines, not to stop, but to adjust. A man who spent 40 years underground learned the difference between a sound that meant danger and a sound that just meant complaint. His knees were complaining. He kept walking. His pack rode on one shoulder, shifted to the other every hour. Inside one wool blanket, a change of socks, a folding knife, a dented tin cup, a box of crackers down to the last sleeve, and a small notebook with a green cover that his wife Dorothy had given him the Christmas before she died. He had not written anything in it yet. He carried it anyway. In his front pocket, $31 and some change. In his chest pocket against his sternum, nothing. That was where he used to keep Dorothy's photograph before he realized he didn't need to carry it to remember her face. The morning was cool for August in Montana. The light came through the lodgepole pines at a low angle, cutting between the trunks in long pale bars that moved across the old roadbed as the trees swayed. Eldon had been following the main rail line since dawn, the one that hadn't seen freight in years by the look of it, but 2 miles back a spur branched off to the left and began climbing in earnest. Narrower, steeper, more deliberate. Somebody had wanted to get somewhere specific. He had followed it without thinking about it much, the way he followed most things now, with no particular urgency and no particular plan, only the practical understanding that a rail line going up a mountain in rural Montana probably ended at something worth looking at. He had time. He had nothing but time, which was a thing his son Gerald had tried to use as an argument for the nursing home in Great Falls. "Dad, you have all the time in the world. You could relax. You could rest." Eldon had looked at Gerald for a long moment and then looked out the window at the parking lot and the strip mall beyond it and said, "I'll think about it." He had thought about it for 3 days. Then he sold his wristwatch, the Longines, with the cracked crystal that Dorothy had given him on their 30th anniversary, to a pawn shop on Montana Avenue for $38, put 31 of it in his pocket, and walked out the back door of Gerald's house at 4 in the morning while everyone was asleep. He did not leave a note. There was nothing to say that the walking wouldn't say better. The spur curved left around a granite outcrop, the lodgepole pines pressing close on both sides, their roots buckling the old roadbed from below so that in places the ballast stone had disappeared entirely under decades of pine duff and encroaching grass. Eldon pushed through a stand of young aspen and the trees opened up, and he stopped. The rails ended. Not gradually, not trailing off into weeds and rust and gradual forgetting. They ended at a timber frame bolted directly into the cliff face. Steel anchor bolts the size of his forearm, driven into solid granite, holding a structure that rose perhaps 30 feet above him and hung out over empty air. He walked to the edge, careful, and looked down. The canyon was narrow and deep. The far wall was perhaps 40 feet away, the same pale gray granite layered in dark horizontal bands, where different eras of earth had settled and compressed over time, longer than Eldon could comfortably imagine. The canyon floor was a long way down, 60 feet, maybe more. A thin strip of shadow and green at the bottom with a thread of water catching what little light reached that far, glinting once and then gone. He stepped back from the edge and looked at the frame. He knew what it was. Immediately, the way you know the face of someone you haven't seen in 50 years, not from conscious recognition, but from something deeper. Some catalog the body keeps that the mind doesn't bother to organize. It was a mine elevator, counterweight design, timber uprights, cast iron wheel at the crown steel cable running over it and disappearing down both sides of the frame. The platform was somewhere below at the canyon floor. The cable connecting to it was slack on the upper side, which meant the brake was engaged. He stood there for a while, not doing anything, just looking. The morning was quiet up here. No road noise, no voices, just the wind moving through the pines below the cliff rim and the occasional tick of cooling metal from the elevator frame as the sun began warming it. Eldon reached out and put his hand on the lower cross beam. Douglas fir, he thought. Dense-grained, slow to rot. The surface had silvered and checked from years of weather, but when he pressed his thumb into a crack, the wood underneath was firm. Not punky, not compromised. Someone had chosen good timber and chosen it carefully. He moved along the frame the way he used to move along a new machine before working on it, introducing himself to it, letting it introduce itself to him. The cast iron wheel at the crown had a rim of rust at its edges, but when he put his weight against the cable, it moved perhaps a quarter inch, not seized at the bearing. Good. The brake drum was mounted on the right upright at about shoulder height. A simple friction mechanism, a curved iron shoe meant to grip the cable drum when released. He could see from where he stood that the shoe had locked fully into the engaged position fused there by years of disuse. A seized spring, most likely, maybe a corroded pin. He looked at his hands. The knuckles were swollen the way old joints get. The left index finger didn't straighten all the way anymore. A piece of roof timber had fallen on it in 1962 and the bone had healed at a slight angle that nobody had ever bothered to correct. The palms were calloused in the specific way of a man who had used tools every day for 5 decades, not the general roughness of outdoor work, but the targeted hardening at pressure points, the places where a wrench handle or a cable or a drill grip wore itself into a man's skin over years of repetition. He wiped dust from the faceplate on the upright, found a manufacturer's plate beneath it, bronze gone green at the edges. He angled his head to read it in the morning light. Carver & Sons, Mechanical, Denver, Colorado. Series C7, manufactured 1931. Eldon went very still. He read it again. Then he took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, put them back, and read it a third time. Series C7. He had learned to service a Series C7 Carver elevator in the autumn of 1940 at the Harlan County No. 4 mine in West Virginia. His teacher had been a man named Doyle Carver, a quiet, deliberate man in his 60s who turned out to be the son of the founder of Carver & Sons, working as a maintenance consultant long after the company had stopped taking orders. Doyle Carver had spent 3 weeks teaching 18-year-old Eldon Pruitt every component of that elevator with a patience and thoroughness that Eldon had never forgotten because it was the first time anyone had ever assumed he was capable of understanding something complicated. He remembered the brake assembly. He remembered the secondary guide cable tension specification, 1/8 inch of deflection per foot of run. He remembered that the Series C7 had a specific weakness in the lower sheave housing when exposed to temperature variation, a tendency for the bearing race to develop micro-fractures that were invisible until they failed. He remembered where to look for them and what to do when he found them. 53 years ago. And his hands still remembered. He sat down on the edge of the cliff with his back against the elevator frame and ate the last of his crackers and drank from his canteen and looked at the sky for a while. It was the kind of blue that only happens at altitude in late summer, deep and clean and without a vent. A hawk turned wide circles somewhere above the south rim of the canyon, riding a thermal, making it look effortless. Eldon was not sure what he was doing here. He was not sure what he had been doing anywhere for the 3 years since Dorothy died, or if there was a word for it that wasn't just waiting. Gerald would say he was being difficult. Gerald's wife, Linda, would say something kinder, but mean the same thing. He looked at the elevator frame. He spent the rest of the morning doing what he had always done with an unfamiliar machine, walking its perimeter, measuring it with attention rather than instruments. He identified the brake seizure as the primary problem. The secondary guide cable had snapped somewhere in the upper third of the shaft and hung in a loose coil against the rock face. The primary cable appeared intact and showed no obvious fraying at the wheel, though he'd need better light and a closer position to be certain. He found the maintenance shed late in the afternoon, following a narrow path along the cliff edge that curved away from the canyon and ended at a low structure he'd glimpsed from the elevator frame but hadn't yet approached. It was small, barely larger than a walk-in closet. walls of corrugated iron sheeting the color of old blood. A hasp and padlock door, but the hasp had rusted through at one screw and came away in his hand when he lifted it. Inside, the air was close and smelled of old grease and dry rot and something else. Beneath those, the mineral stillness of a place that had been sealed for a long time. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. There was a hand pump lubricator with a partial can of gear grease, still inside, the grease hardened at the top, but still viable beneath the crust. There was a small petrol can with less than a pint remaining, a rag stuffed in the spout. A rusted but intact spool of steel wire, stiff and oxidized, but uncracked. A handful of square head bolts in an old coffee tin, threads still clean. A block and tackle pulley with its housing seized, but its sheaves intact. 2 oil cans, one of which still held fluid when he tipped it. He would mix the gear grease with the petrol, apply it to the brake mechanism, let it sit, come back to it. He knew this process the way he knew how to make coffee, not from thinking, but from repetition. He was setting the oil can back on the shelf when he noticed the papers. They were under a folded tarp on the bottom shelf, tucked back against the wall where the iron sheeting met the floor. Not hidden exactly, but not visible unless you crouched down and looked. Eldon crouched down and looked, and his knees sent their objection up through both thighs, and he ignored them and pulled the papers out. They were in a manila folder, the kind with a metal brad at the top. The folder had been in a plastic sleeve at some point, but the sleeve had cracked and split with age. The papers inside were protected enough, crisp at the edges, a little yellowed, but legible. The cover sheet had a logo at the top. A small mountain and compass design printed in dark blue with text beneath it, Meridian Land Company, Denver, Colorado. Beneath that site, survey report. Canyon Parcel 7, North Coldwater District, Montana. Prepared, June 1991. Eldon sat back on his heels and looked at the folder for a moment. Then he opened it. The survey was thorough. Soil composition, subterranean water table, mineral deposit estimates, copper primarily with trace silver in the lower canyon formation. Estimated extraction yield. Projected operational timeline. Cost analysis for access road construction and equipment installation. He read it the way he had always read technical documents, slowly and completely, starting at the beginning, not skipping to conclusions. It took him 20 minutes. When he was finished, he turned back to the last page where someone had written a note in the margin in ballpoint pen, the ink faded but legible. No living heirs confirmed. Proceed with Q4 1993, filing. Eldon read the note twice. Then he looked at the date on the cover sheet again. June 1991. Someone from Denver had been here 2 years ago. Someone had crawled through that same broken shed door, read the same smell of old grease and sealed air, and left satisfied with what they'd found, or rather satisfied with what they hadn't found. No living heirs confirmed. He put the folder down on the shelf and stood up slowly, steadying himself with one hand on the doorframe. Outside, the afternoon had gone long and amber, the shadows of the pines stretching east across the old roadbed. He stood in the shed doorway and looked at the elevator frame and thought about the word parcel, the way it flattened a place into a unit of transaction, the way it made a canyon into a line item. He went back to the elevator. He worked on the brake mechanism until the light failed, applying the thinned grease mixture, waiting, applying again. By the time he unrolled his blanket on a flat patch of ground, away from the cliff edge, the brake drum had moved twice under his weight against the release lever, not freely, but moving. Promising. He slept well, which surprised him. The ground was hard. A rock he hadn't felt during the day made itself known around midnight. The air had a cold edge that came down off the high peaks and found him in the trees. But he slept without the restless half-waking that had followed him from town to town for 3 years, the kind of sleep that comes when something specific and manageable waits for you in the morning. He was up before full light. He ate nothing. The crackers were gone, and he hadn't thought far enough ahead to have something else. He drank from his canteen and worked the brake mechanism by the cold, early light until it moved a quarter turn without his full weight behind it. He applied a final coat of thinned grease, walked the perimeter of the frame one more time, checked the primary cable at the wheel, found it sound. Then he loaded the platform with rocks. He carried them from the rubble at the base of the cliff in armloads, stacking them toward the center of the platform until the weight felt close to his own. The counterweight cable went taut. The drum held position without the brake engaged. He added 2 more rocks, watched the cable, watched the sheave housing. Everything held. He removed the rocks one by one. When the last one came off, he stood beside the platform and breathed and listened to the morning. He had $31, a wool blanket, a green notebook with nothing written in it yet. He had just repaired a mine elevator that had been broken for years. By himself, on the side of a cliff in Montana, at 74 years old. He stepped onto the platform. The iron was rough underfoot, not just rust, but the texture of old metal and weathered timber, a surface that had held other men's boots in other years. He gripped the pipe railing with both hands. His fingers found their grip the way they always had, thumb over the first 2 fingers, the small callus at the base of his palm settling into the bar. The same grip he had learned at 18 in a mine in West Virginia, with a man named Doyle Carver standing beside him. He reached back and released the handbrake, easing it open a fraction at a time. The descent was gentle. The counterweight did its work without argument, and he let the cable run through the drum at a walking pace. The canyon walls rose on either side as he dropped below the cliff edge, not the way walls rise in a room closing you in, but the way the world opens when you go deep into it. The sky above became a strip of blue between 2 walls of gray and amber rock, very far up, very still. The temperature dropped by several degrees in the first 20 feet, the cool mineral air of the canyon rising to meet him. He watched the stone layers pass dark shale, pale sediment, dark shale again. Each line a different era, a different slow patience. The rock was polished in some places, chalky in others. Water had run down these walls for a long time. He was still looking at the stone when the platform settled onto the canyon floor. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the railing, not moving. The air was different down here, cooler, still, carrying a faint mineral damp that reminded him of well water. He could hear the thread of water somewhere to his left, running along the base of the cliff through gravel unhurried. Above him the sky was that narrow strip, blue and remote, like something seen through a crack in the world. He turned. The cabin was there. He nearly missed it. Not because it was small, but because it fit so completely into the cliff face that his eye passed over it once before understanding what it was seeing. The canyon wall curved outward overhead in a broad, shallow overhang, and the cabin sat so deep beneath that overhang that its corrugated iron roof was the same shadow gray as the rock above it. The squared log walls had weathered to deep silver brown. Moss had crept along the base logs. Decades of pine debris and dust had collected in the gap between the back wall and the stone behind it, so that the structure seemed to have grown there rather than been built. He walked toward it slowly. The closer he got, the more detail resolved out of the dimness. A narrow window to the left of the door glass, intact, hazed with grime. A lean-to shed on the right side, its roof sagging at one corner but not broken. A flat stone at the threshold, worn smooth in the center in a way that took many boots and many years. He stopped in front of the door. There was nothing threatening about the place, nothing that made him want to step back. What held him there was something closer to the feeling he'd had sometimes in mines just before entering a new working area. The awareness that what he was about to do he could only do once for the first time. He lifted the latch. The door swung inward with the slow reluctance of something that had been closed a long time, the hinges giving a low, soft groan. Not a squeal, but the sound of something waking from a long sleep. The smell that came out was dry and close and faintly sweet. Old timber, dust, and beneath those something he couldn't name, a room's smell that had been sealed in and concentrated over years until it had become its own thing. Light came in past his shoulders and moved across the plank floor in a long, pale rectangle. He followed it with his eyes moving from one thing to the next. The floor was sound. He could see that without stepping on it, no soft spots, no collapse, just a thin skin of dust and grit. The wood stove sat against the far wall, a heavy cast-iron thing on 4 squat legs, its door slightly ajar. The black steel gone to pale surface rust, but the body whole and uncracked. A bed frame along the left wall, squared timber pegged at the corners, the mattress long since rotted and collapsed, but the frame itself solid. Shelves along the right wall, floor to ceiling, tins, glass jars with metal lids. He counted them without opening anything yet, just accounting for what was there. Dried beans, salt, lamp oil sealed in brown glass, a few jars of something he'd need better light to identify. At the back of the room, a basin set into a low counter, and beside the basin, a hand-pump iron lever connected to a pipe that disappeared down through the floor. Eldon stood in the doorway of that cabin at the bottom of a canyon that no one could see from above, in a place that a company in Denver had described as an empty parcel ready for mineral extraction, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years settle into his chest, like something returning to its proper place. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter than that and more reliable. He stepped across the threshold. He crouched in front of the stove and opened the door the rest of the way. The firebox was clean, not clean, just empty and dry, the ash long since settled to nothing. He checked the flue pipe where it passed through the wall, solid at the joints. He didn't know yet if it would draw, but it was intact. He pressed down on the bed frame boards. They didn't shift. He moved along the shelves reading labels, faded but legible on most. He gripped the pump handle. It resisted. He worked it slowly, not forcing it, just asking it to remember what it was for. The mechanism was dry and stiff and gave nothing for a long time. He kept at it steady strokes, the kind of patience that comes from knowing that most resistance is not refusal, it's just friction. 1 minute. 2. His shoulder ached. He kept going. Then a sound. A hollow pull from somewhere below, and a cough of dark water he let run past, and then after a few more strokes, something cold and clean coming up through the pipe and spilling into the basin. He held his hand under it. The water was very cold. It tasted of stone and depth and quiet. He stood at the basin and let it run over his palm and did not move for a while. Outside, the thin strip of sky above the canyon walls had gone from blue to the particular pale gold of late afternoon. The thread of water along the base of the cliff kept running its quiet course. Somewhere above, the elevator cable hung still and ready. Eldon turned the pump handle back to its resting position. He looked around the cabin, the stove, the shelves, the bed frame, the basin, and something in his chest that had been tight for a long time loosened just a fraction. He had $31 and no plan, and nowhere that was expecting him. He had also just made a working elevator and found a working pump in a cabin that a Denver land company had assumed was empty and unclaimed. He sat down on the floor with his back against the bed frame and his legs stretched out in front of him and looked at the door he had just come through, still standing open to the canyon air. Light moved across the threshold in a slow, shifting bar. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the green notebook and the stub of pencil he kept with it. He opened to the first page. He wrote the date, August 1993. He wrote where he was: the canyon, the cliff, the elevator, the cabin, the water. Then he stopped and looked at the page and added one more line. The door was unlocked. He closed the notebook. He put it in his shirt pocket against his chest, where it had always been close but empty. Outside, the canyon received the last of the day's light along its upper walls, a warm amber moving slowly downward. Eldon sat with his back against the solid timber of the bed frame, breathing the air of a room that had been sealed for years and was now open, and listened to the place settle around him. He did not think about Gerald. He did not think about the nursing home in Great Falls. He did not think about the folder in the maintenance shed with the Meridian Land Company logo and the note in the margin about heirs. He thought about the pump handle and the sound it made when the water finally came. He had enough. He woke before the light reached the canyon floor. There was a period each morning, brief and particular, when the sky above the canyon walls turned a pale, luminous blue, while the floor itself remained in complete shadow, as if the day were being assembled somewhere above and had not yet been delivered. Eldon had noticed this on his first morning lying on the plank floor with his blanket pulled to his chin, watching the rectangle of sky above the canyon rim go from black to gray to that particular blue. He noticed it again on the second morning. By the third, he had begun to expect it, which was the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. He built a small fire in the wood stove. The flue pipe had been blocked, a bird's nest matted grass and mud packed into the first elbow above the stove box with the small papery ruins of a wasp colony layered on top of it. He had cleared it the first afternoon using a length of stiff wire he'd straightened from a coil in the lean-to shed, feeding it up through the firebox until the blockage broke loose and fell. He'd spent an hour after that checking the pipe joints, tightening what he could, pressing gaps with strips of flattened tin from a rusted can. When he finally put a match to a handful of dry pine needles and watched the smoke rise without hesitation, straight up, no backdraft. No hesitation, he had crouched in front of the open stove box door and watched it draw for longer than was strictly necessary. Now he put the dented pot on and waited for the water to heat. The lean-to shed had given him more than he had expected. Beyond the maintenance supplies he'd already inventoried, there were tools. A short-handled axe, a draw knife, a hand drill with a set of bits in an oilcloth wrap, a float for smoothing plaster, a wooden mallet, a collection of chisels in varying sizes. All of it left with the deliberateness of a man who intended to come back and then did not. The tools were dusty and stiff with disuse, but sound underneath. A man who had kept tools that long had kept them right. He had also found in the corner of the shed under a collapsed shelf 3 sealed tins of kerosene and a lamp with a cracked chimney he replaced with a jar whose neck fit well enough to hold a flame. He had light in the evenings now. He had hot water in the mornings. He had the stove, the pump, the bed frame. He'd rebuilt the sleeping surface from boards salvaged from a broken shelf, laid crossways with a folded top between him and the wood. It was not comfortable in any way. A person who had options would choose. It was better than the canyon floor. The coffee tin in the back of the provisions shelf held coffee grounds sealed well enough that when he pried the lid with his knife, the smell that came out was real. Aged a little flat, but recognizably coffee. He had been making it each morning with 2 careful spoonfuls and more restraint than he liked, because there was perhaps 3 weeks' worth, and he didn't know yet when he'd get to town. He poured the hot water through the grounds in the tin cup and sat on the stool near the open door and watched the light begin its slow descent of the south canyon wall. It reached the raised garden beds first, the way it always did, a line of warmth moving down the pale stone until it found the soil and warmed it. He had discovered the garden on his second day, walked past it twice without understanding what he was seeing, taking the humped shapes along the south-facing wall for debris. It was the beans that told him. A few had climbed a section of old wire fencing still stapled to a post sunk in the canyon wall, and when he looked closely, he could see the pods small, papery dry from the season, but unmistakably beans. He had spent the better part of a day on the garden. The raised beds were framed in railroad ties, the same heavy timber as the track above, hauled down here somehow, which was a detail he kept returning to because it spoke of effort and intention and a man who thought in terms of years rather than seasons. The soil inside was dark, compacted at the surface, but loose and workable underneath once he broke through with the edge of a salvaged board. He turned it with his hands, working row by row. What came up was good earth, black and slightly damp, carrying the smell of something still living. He found wild onions by their smell, dozens of them in loose clusters near the downhill end of the beds, their thin green shoots pushing up through the dead matter around them. He thinned them carefully, leaving the strongest ones, spacing them with his fingers, the way a man does when he's been taught to give things room. The squash vine he spent an hour tracing back to its root, cutting away what was dead and tying what was green to a length of wire he stretched between 2 posts. The volunteer beans he staked with short wire lengths bent into hooks. They were leggy from competition and pale from too little light, but the roots looked sound. Given room and the morning sun that reached this wall, he thought they would come. He drank his coffee and thought about this, not strategically, not with any particular plan, just the way a man thinks about a living thing he's decided to pay attention to. The garden had been going without anyone to tend it. Something had kept going anyway. That seemed worth honoring. On the fourth day, he went to the high shelf. He had been leaving it alone the way you sometimes leave the most important thing in a room until you feel ready for it. The lower shelves he had cleaned and organized on the first day, wiping down the tins, checking seals, sorting by type. But the top shelf had stayed untouched, its contents obscured behind a layer of dust thick enough to hold its own shadows. He dragged the workbench over and stood on it and began lifting things down one at a time. A tin of lamp oil still sealed. A folded piece of oilcloth. 2 glass jars of something dried, a short-handled brush with stiff bristles. And behind the lamped oil tin pressed into the back corner where the shelf met the wall, a book. He didn't recognize it as a book at first. What he saw was leather, dark brown, swollen slightly with age, the cover creased and soft. He lifted it carefully and felt its weight. Thick pages, a hand-sewn binding. He carried it to the window and held it in the light coming through the grimy glass. The handwriting on the first page was small and deliberate. The letters formed with the kind of precision that suggested a man who had learned to write carefully and never stopped. September 2nd, 1952. Canyon. Clear. 58 degrees at dawn. Elevator running well. The man from West Virginia left yesterday. I will try to write every day now. Eldon lowered the book. He looked at the date again. September 2nd, 1952. He read it a third time. He had left this canyon on the 1st of September, 1952. He remembered the date because it was his mother's birthday, and he had been thinking about calling her from the next town if he could find a payphone. He had been 33 years old and working freelance since the Harlan No. 4 had closed its shaft for the summer season, and he'd picked up a contract job through a machine shop in Billings, 3 weeks installing an elevator mechanism at a private site, cash on completion, no questions about the location asked or answered. He had done the work, taken his money. He had ridden back up the elevator for the last time, walked back down the spur line to the main grade, and caught the westbound freight to Billings without looking back. He had not known the man's name. He had seen him twice in 3 weeks, once on the first day when a lean, quiet man in his 50s had shown him the cliff and the shaft, and pointed to the equipment waiting at the top, with an economy of words that Eldon had respected, and once on the last day when the same man had counted cash from a coffee tin into Eldon's palm, without meeting his eyes the way a private person handles a transaction he's grateful for, but would rather not have needed. He had not known this man wrote anything down. He had not known he was the first entry in a journal that went on for 31 years. He sat down on the workbench, the journal open across his knees, and he read. Chester Aldgate had come to this canyon in the summer of 1952 from Colorado, where he had spent 20 years working as a drilling foreman for a copper operation in the mountain district west of Denver. The journal was not explicit about why he had left, but it was precise about what he had left behind: a dispute with his employer over safety conditions in a section of the lower mine. A report he had filed that had been ignored, and an accident 6 weeks later that had killed 4 men Chester had been warning about for months. He had left before the inquiry, which was not cowardice, the journal said plainly. It was the understanding that the inquiry would reach the conclusion the employer required it to reach, and Chester Aldgate had decided he was done participating in conclusions other men had already written. He had found the canyon by following the old spur line the same way Eldon had, for the same reason: it went somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere, and a man who had spent his life underground knew how to follow a track that meant business. The journal's early entries were detailed. How Chester had found the cabin structure already partly built, someone else's abandoned start, the walls up, but the roof incomplete, the interior rough. How he had finished it over the summer and fall of 1952, scrounging timber and corrugated iron from the abandoned mine site up on the ridge. How he had dug the garden beds himself with a spade and a determination that the journal recorded without drama. And in the entries from that first September, the month after Eldon had left, Chester wrote about the elevator. "The mechanism works perfectly, better than I hoped. I have been down and up 6 times today just to confirm it." The young man from West Virginia knew what he was doing. He didn't say much, but men who know what they're doing rarely need to. I have been trying to remember his first name. I believe it was Eldon. I may be wrong. I should have asked. Eldon put his thumb on that sentence and held it there. He sat in the cabin at the bottom of a canyon in Montana, in a place he had first visited 41 years ago for 3 weeks as a young man who needed work. And he read a dead man's account of those 3 weeks from the other side, and the particular silence of the canyon wrapped around him in a way that he did not try to name or manage. He kept reading. Chester had stayed. That was the simple fact of it underneath all the daily entries about weather and harvest and the elevator mechanism and the deer that came through the gap in the North Canyon wall. Chester Aldgate had found a place and stayed in it, which was not a small thing, and the journal was the record of a man who understood it was not a small thing. The years moved through the journal in seasons. Hard winters when the canyon floor stayed in shadow all day, and the cold off the walls was a physical weight. Springs when the water table rose and the garden beds had to be raised. Summers when the beans climbed higher than Chester had planned for, and he built new wire frames to accommodate them. Falls when he put things by for the coming cold with the methodical care of someone who has learned once what it costs to be unprepared. He wrote about the elevator every few months. Small maintenance notes, measurements, observations about cable tension and brake wear. He replaced the primary cable in 1961. The brake shoe in 1967. He noted in 1971 that the secondary guide cable was beginning to show stress at the upper sheave and would need attention in the next year or 2. In 1973, he replaced it alone, which the journal noted took him 4 days and was the hardest physical work he had done since finishing the cabin roof. He wrote about the town of Coldwater, 6 miles down the mountain by trail, where he went for supplies 4 times a year. He paid cash. He was courteous. He did not explain himself, and the people of Coldwater, to their credit, mostly did not ask. And then, in an entry from September of 1968, Chester wrote about a truck, a black truck on the rails today. 2 men I have not seen before with instruments I recognize as surveying equipment. They spent several hours at the top of the shaft. One of them examined the elevator frame for a long time. They left something under a rock at the top of the cliff, a business card. Meridian Land Company, Denver, Colorado. I did not go up while they were there, and I did not take the card. I do not know what they were surveying or who sent them, but I know what a mineral survey crew looks like, and I know what it means when they come back twice. Eldon turned the page. They came back 3 weeks later. Same truck, different men. They did not stay as long. One of them looked over the edge of the cliff for a while, then they left. I have been thinking about what I know of property law, which is not much. The canyon came with nothing when I settled here, no deed, no prior claim. I could find nothing in the county records that my name is attached to. I have been here 16 years, and I have not thought much about what that means in terms of ownership because there was no one interested in contesting it. I am thinking about it now. Eldon set the journal down on his knee and looked at the window. Outside, the canyon had reached its brightest point of the day, the hour when the sun sat directly above the narrow gap between the walls and sent light straight down to the floor, turning the soil in the garden beds a deep, warm brown and catching the thread of water along the base of the cliff so it looked for that 1 hour like something valuable. He picked up the journal and kept reading. Chester had gone to Coldwater in the fall of 1968 and found the county clerk's office and asked carefully and without specifics about the process for filing a claim on unoccupied canyon land in the district. The clerk had told him that a quiet settlement claim with improvements made could be formalized through the Territorial Land Office with a supporting affidavit and a fee of $12. It was a slow process, but a sound one. Chester had filed the claim in November of 1968. He had paid the $12. And then, in a brief entry from the spring of 1979, He wrote about the visit to a notary public in Coldwater, and the document he had had prepared, and witnessed a last will and testament, simple and specific. I have made a will. I have left the canyon and the cabin and everything in it to the man who installed the elevator in July of 1952. I wrote it that way on purpose. Not his name, because I am not certain of his name, and I do not want a wrong name to void the thing. The man who installed the elevator will know who he is. He will be able to prove it if he is the kind of man I believe he is. I left a copy with the notary in Coldwater. I kept a copy here. I believe that is sufficient. Eldon turned to the next page. The entries continued through 1979 and 1980. The garden, the elevator, a particularly difficult winter, a fox that took up residence in the north end of the lean-to for 3 weeks in February and departed without explanation. Chester's handwriting was changing by this point, slower, more deliberate. The letters formed with greater effort and less automaticity. The journal entries grew shorter. He had been reading for most of the afternoon when he reached the final pages. The last several entries were sometimes only 1 or 2 sentences. A date, a temperature, elevator running well, garden coming in late this year. The handwriting was not shaky. That was the thing that struck Eldon about it. Not shaky, just slower. The care of a man who has learned to spend his energy precisely. The second to last entry read, "Good canyon. Good years." That was all. Eldon sat with that page open for a long time. The light was going by now, the canyon floor back in shadow, the strip of sky above the rim fading through amber toward the first pale suggestion of evening. He could hear the thread of water along the base of the cliff. The stove had gone cold. He should build it back up. He turned to the last page. The handwriting here was different from the last few pages. Not different from Chester's hand in general, but different in the way that a man's writing is different when he sits down for a specific purpose with specific words already formed in his mind. Steadier, more deliberate, as if he had practiced it. "Whoever finds this place, it's yours now. Take care of it. The elevator will tell you if you're the right man." Eldon read it 3 times. Then he closed the journal and sat in the dimming canyon with it on his knees, and did not move for a while. He was thinking about Chester Aldgate, who had come to a canyon in Montana in 1952 and stayed for 31 years and written down the days. He was thinking about the entry from September 2nd of that year. "I will try to write every day now," written the morning after Eldon had walked back up the shaft and out of the canyon without looking back. He was thinking about the phrase the man from West Virginia left yesterday, and the sentence that followed, "I should have asked." He was thinking about a will, written in 1979, that left everything to a man whose name Chester wasn't certain of, on the faith that the right man would be able to prove who he was. He was thinking about a company in Denver that had decided in 1991 that there were no living heirs and the land was available. Eldon put the journal on the shelf beside the window. The low shelf, not the high one where the morning light would reach it, and stood up carefully, one hand on the edge of the counter to steady himself. His left index finger didn't straighten all the way. He straightened the others slowly in stages, the way you ease a stubborn mechanism back into its working position. He needed to go to Coldwater. He thought about this practically as he built the fire back up in the stove. 6 miles by trail. Chester had mentioned the trail several times in the journal, and Eldon had found the start of it the day before heading north along the canyon floor and through the gap in the rock wall where the deer came through. 6 miles was a morning's walk for a man his age on even ground. The trail would not be even ground, and it had not been maintained in the 10 years since Chester died, but it would be walkable. He needed supplies, more food than he had. He needed to understand what the situation with the Meridian Land Survey actually meant in legal terms. Whether a survey from 1991 translated into a claim, whether a claim translated into rights. Whether any of it superseded a will filed in 1979. He did not know land law. He knew mine law broadly, and equipment maintenance, and the way a cable behaves under load at different temperatures, and how to rebuild a hand pump from components, and how to judge whether timber has gone soft under a sound surface. These were the things he knew. They were not nothing. He heated water and made the last of the coffee with more grounds than he'd been allowing himself because it seemed like an evening that warranted it. He sat by the open door with the cup in both hands and watched the canyon walls hold the last warmth of the day in their pale stone. He thought about Gerald, not with anger, which surprised him. Gerald was not a bad man. Gerald was a man who looked at his 74-year-old father and saw a problem to be managed, which was a failure of imagination rather than a failure of love. Gerald had never gone underground. Gerald had never put his hand on a machine and felt the machine's problem through his palm. Gerald had grown up watching his father come home with black in the creases of his face and had decided reasonably enough that there had to be a better way to live. Gerald was probably calling hospitals in 3 counties right now. Eldon felt a mild guilt about this and let it be mild, because Gerald was a grown man with a telephone and the capacity to understand that his father was still alive somewhere in Montana and had chosen to be there. Dorothy would have understood immediately. Dorothy had been a woman who understood that some men need a problem they can actually see in order to sleep at night. He finished the coffee. He rinsed the cup with water from the pump and set it on the shelf. He took out the green notebook. He opened it to the 2nd page after the entry he'd made on the first night and wrote the date. He wrote about the journal and what it contained. He wrote Chester Aldgate's name and the dates that mattered. He wrote about the will. He wrote about Meridian Land Company and the survey from 1991 and the note in the margin about heirs. Then he wrote a separate line set apart from the rest. September 1st, 1952. I left. September the 2nd, 1952. He started writing. He looked at that for a moment. Then he wrote one more line beneath it. He was waiting for someone to come back. He didn't know it was me. He closed the notebook and put it in his shirt pocket. Outside, the first stars had appeared in the strip of sky above the canyon walls. Not many, just the brightest ones that didn't need full darkness to show themselves. The thread of water along the base of the cliff kept moving through the dark with its small, patient sound. Eldon sat in the open doorway of a cabin that had been waiting for 10 years and thought about what it meant to be in the right place at the right time and whether there was any such thing as the right time or whether there was just time and you either showed up in it or you didn't. He had showed up. He went to bed early and slept without difficulty, which was several nights in a row now, which was something he hadn't managed in 3 years. In the morning, he would walk to Coldwater. He would find out what he needed to find out. He would handle what needed handling. He had rebuilt a mine elevator with a partial can of gear grease and a coil of borrowed wire. He had made cold, clean water come out of a pump that hadn't moved in a decade. He had turned soil that hadn't been tended in 10 years and found it still good underneath. He was 74 years old. He was not done yet. Not even close. The trail north through the canyon gap was 6 miles of the kind of country that doesn't apologize for itself. Loose shale on the upper sections exposed root systems across the lower trail where pines had claimed the path over 10 years of no foot traffic and 2 creek crossings where the stepping stones Chester had mentioned in the journal had shifted enough to require judgment about where to put a foot and how much weight to commit before the next step. Eldon made it in just under 3 hours. He was not fast, and he knew it, and he stopped when he needed to, and did not perform endurance for anyone because there was no one watching. He drank from his canteen at the first creek crossing and sat on a boulder for 10 minutes at the top of the shale section and watched a pair of Clark's nutcrackers work the pine cones in the trees above him with the focused efficiency of creatures who have a system and trust it. Then he got up and kept going. Coldwater was smaller than he had expected. A main street with a grain elevator at one end and a fuel stop at the other, and between them a hardware store, a post office, a diner with a hand-lettered sign in the window that said breakfast all day. A barber shop that appeared to be operating out of what had once been a house, and a low building with a hand-painted sign reading Coldwater County Administrative Offices, Land Records, Licensing. He stood on the sidewalk outside the administrative building for a moment. The morning was still cool. A pickup truck went past on the main street, and the driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in the way that people acknowledge each other in small towns, not a wave. Exactly. Just a recognition that another person exists and that this is worth noting. Eldon went inside. The front room smelled of old paper and floor wax and the particular institutional stillness of a place that handles the quiet business of permanence deeds, claims records of who owns what and when they got it and what they owe on it. A wooden counter ran across the middle of the room. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling shelving held the kind of organized accumulation that takes decades to build and minutes to lose if someone stops caring about the system. A woman was standing at one of the shelves with her back to him, pulling a folder from a row of identical folders with the practiced certainty of someone who has done it 10,000 times. She was perhaps 55 or 60 solid and deliberate in her movements, wearing reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Her hair was gray at the temples and darker brown elsewhere, cut practically kept out of her face. She turned when she heard him come in. "Help you?" "I hope so," Eldon said. "I'm looking for information about a land claim in the Canyon District, maybe 8 miles north and east of town up the old spur line." The woman set her folder on the counter. She looked at him with the kind of calm, unhurried assessment that comes from years of handling the public not unfriendly, but not performing friendliness either. Measuring what kind of problem had just walked through the door. "Rowena Fitch," she said. "I'm the county land clerk. Have been for 28 years. What's the claim?" The name on it would be Chester Aldgate. He filed a settlement claim in 1968. He passed in 1983. Something shifted in Rowena Fitch's expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular alertness of a person who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting. "Chester Aldgate," she said. "You know the name." "I know the file." She was already moving toward the shelves before she finished the sentence. "Or I know where the file should be, which has been a source of professional aggravation to me for some time." She worked the shelves with the efficiency of a woman who had built and maintained this system herself, moving through sections with quiet confidence, pulling one drawer and then another, rejecting them, moving further back. Eldon stood at the counter and waited. "Settlement claim is here," Rowena said from the back of the room. "Filed November 1968. Fee paid. Improvements, documented cabin structure, water access, cultivated land. All in order." A pause. "There should be a corresponding estate file from 1983 when he died. That's the one that troubles me." "Why does it trouble you?" She came back to the counter with 2 folders. She set them down and opened the first one. The settlement claim documents neatly ordered, the filing fee receipt still attached to the inside cover with a rusted paper clip. "Because it's not where it should be," she said. She opened the second folder. "This is what I found when Meridian Land Company submitted their survey and application in 1991. They claimed there was no valid estate filing for the Aldgate parcel, which meant it would revert to unappropriated territorial land after the statutory period. I looked for the estate file then and couldn't locate it. I filed a flag on the application. It's still there. You can see it." She turned the folder toward him and pointed to a pink slip clipped to the inside cover. "Pending verification of estate disposition. That flag is the only reason Meridian's application hasn't been fully approved. My supervisor has been asking me to remove it for 2 years. Why haven't you?" Rowena looked at him steadily. "Because I couldn't find the estate file, Mr. Pruitt, Eldon Pruitt." She wrote the name on the notepad at her elbow. "Mr. Pruitt. I couldn't find the file, but the absence of a file and the non-existence of one are different things, and I have been doing this job long enough to know the difference. Files get misfiled. Drawers get reorganized by people who think they're helping. Things end up where they don't belong." She looked back at the shelves. "I just hadn't found it yet." "Chester left a will," Eldon said. "He mentions it in his journal. He had it notarized in Coldwater Spring of 1979. Rowena went still. "He kept a copy in the cabin," Eldon said. "I have it." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out the folded document he had found that morning, tucked into the back cover of Chester's journal, a single sheet of paper folded in thirds, the notary's seal still faintly visible in the lower right corner. The ink faded but entirely legible. He had read it 4 times on the trail down. He unfolded it and set it on the counter. Rowena put her reading glasses on. She read it without speaking, then she read it again. Eldon watched her face and saw the expression of a woman who has maintained a professional position against institutional pressure for 2 years and has just been handed the reason she was right to do so. The will was simple. Chester Aldgate, being of sound mind, left the canyon property, the cabin, the elevator structure, the cultivated land, all appurtenances and improvements to the man who installed the elevator mechanism in July of 1952. If he can be found, or if he finds his way here. Witnessed by a notary. Public 1 Harold Getz, Coldwater, Montana, April 12, 1979. Harold Getz's stamp was faded but present. Harold Getz retired in 1985, Rowena said. He's still alive. He lives on Birch Street. She looked up from the document. This is valid on its face. The question is whether we can establish that you are the man described. I installed the elevator in July of 1952, Eldon said. I was hired through a machine shop in Billings. Cash work. 3 weeks. I knew the Carver Series C7 mechanism because I'd trained on one in West Virginia in 1940. Can you prove any of that? I can describe every component of that elevator in detail that nobody would know who hadn't worked on one. I can tell you the secondary guide cable tension specification. The specific failure point in the lower sheave housing under temperature variation, and exactly which bolt on the brake assembly cross-threads if you torque it past 40 foot-pounds, because the casting has a slight flaw in the Series C7 that Carver never corrected. He paused. There may also be a service receipt. Chester kept records. Rowena looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Wait here," and went back to the shelves. He heard her moving through the room, methodical, unhurried, working a search pattern rather than hoping for luck. Drawers opened and closed. Folders were lifted and replaced. Eldon stood at the counter and looked at Chester's will lying open on the wood and thought about a man in his 50s standing at a notary's desk in this same town in the spring of 1979, writing out his intentions for a person whose name he wasn't certain of and trusting that the right man would be able to prove himself. Chester Aldgate had been a man who believed that good work left a legible record. He had not been wrong. Rowena came back. She was carrying a folder different from the others, thinner, with a water stain along the bottom edge that had warped the cardboard and probably explained why it had been misfiled. She set it on the counter and opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The estate filing from 1983, completed by the county sheriff after Chester's death, cause listed as natural causes, no next of kin located. A property inventory, and a single folded sheet smaller than the others that Rowena lifted out carefully and unfolded on the counter beside Chester's will. It was a service receipt, handwritten in Chester's precise, careful script. Received elevator installation services. Canyon property, July 1st through September 1st. 1952. From E. Pruitt, mechanic, Harlan County, West Virginia. Payment $47 cash rendered in full. Signed, C. Aldgate. Eldon looked at it for a long time. $47. He had not been certain of the exact number until now. Chester had written it down to the dollar, the way a man records what he owes, rather than simply what he paid with the precision of someone who understands that the record is a form of respect. E. Pruitt, Rowena said. Eldon Pruitt. That's me. She looked at him with the same steady, unhurried assessment she'd given him when he walked in. Then she looked at the receipt and the will side by side on the counter. Then she picked up her notepad and wrote something on it and said, "I need to make some calls. There's a diner across the street. The coffee is better than it has any right to be for a town this size." Eldon nodded. "How long?" "A few hours. The flag on Meridian's application means I have to go through the state land office, and they don't move fast. But the flag is there, which means the application is still provisional, which means we have standing to contest it." She looked up from her notepad. "Mr. Pruitt, where are you staying?" "In the canyon," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "In the cabin?" "Yes." Rowena Fitch picked up the telephone on her desk and began dialing. Eldon put on his jacket and went across the street to the diner, and the coffee was in fact better than it had any right to be. He was on his second cup when the man came in. He noticed him the way you notice someone whose entry into a room changes the room's quality without being loud about it. A man in his early 50s, well-dressed in the way of someone who has chosen clothes designed to telegraph competence rather than wealth. Dark jacket, no tie, good boots that had never been near mud. He stood in the diner doorway for a moment, scanning the room, and his eyes found Eldon and stayed there with the recognition of someone who's been given a description and is confirming it. He came to the table and sat down across from Eldon without being invited. "Mr. Pruitt," he said. "My name is Grover Hask. I represent Meridian Land Company." Eldon wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Word travels fast in a small town. I've been in cold water for 2 days," Hask said. He had a careful, measured voice, the voice of a man who had learned that the way you say something determines whether people hear the words or the intention behind them. "I've been expecting that someone might show up eventually in connection with the Aldgate parcel. I did not expect it to be someone with a direct claim. And yet here we are." Hask folded his hands on the table. "I want to be straightforward with you. Meridian has invested significant resources in the survey and application process for that canyon. We have a valid exploration permit issued in good faith based on the information available to us at the time, specifically that there was no valid estate disposition on record." "There's a will," Eldon said. "I understand that a document has been presented. Whether it constitutes a valid disposition is a question for the land office to determine." He paused. "I'd like to offer you an alternative to that process, which will take months and is not free." Eldon looked at him. "What kind of alternative?" "Meridian is prepared to offer you $8,000 for a signed quitclaim on any interest you have or may have in the Aldgate parcel. That's a significant sum for a property with no road access, no utilities, and a structure that, by any reasonable assessment, is at the end of its useful life." He said it pleasantly, without visible malice, the way a man presents a calculation he believes is fair. "You would walk away with enough money to be comfortable for some time. Meridian would proceed with its extraction project. No months of legal proceedings, no uncertainty." Eldon looked at his coffee cup. He thought about the water that had come up cold and clean through the pump after 20 minutes of patient work. He thought about the beans climbing the wire frame along the south wall of the garden bed, pale from competition but sound at the root. He thought about Chester Aldgate sitting down on the 2nd of September 1952, the day after a young man from West Virginia had walked back up the elevator shaft for the last time and beginning to write. He thought about the note in the margin of the Meridian survey report. "No living heirs confirmed. Proceed with Q for 1993. Filing." They had been so certain. They had come with their instruments and their calculations and their assessment of what the canyon was worth in tons of extracted copper, and they had looked at the absence of a filed estate document and concluded that the absence of a record was the same as the absence of a claim. But a man named Chester Aldgate had spent 31 years maintaining an elevator that Eldon Pruitt had built, keeping it in working order for the man he hoped would someday come back and use it. And Rowena Fitch had been keeping a flag on a provisional permit for 2 years because she knew the difference between a file that didn't exist and a file she hadn't found yet. And Eldon had walked up a spur line in Montana because it went somewhere, and he had repaired a mine elevator with a partial can of gear grease, and he had found a journal that began the day he left. "No," he said. Hask was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Pruitt, I want you to understand the practical reality here. You are 74 years old. You have no legal representation. The state land office process is—" "I heard you," Eldon said. "The answer is no." Hask looked at him with the expression of a man recalculating. Not angry that came later, if it came at all. First came the recalibration, the adjustment of approach. "May I ask why?" Eldon set his coffee cup down. He looked at Grover Hask across the table and thought about how to say what he wanted to say, and decided to say it simply. Because Chester Aldgate spent 31 years in that canyon and kept the elevator running and wrote down the days and left the place to the man who built it, and that man is me. And I'm not going to sign a piece of paper that says otherwise for $8,000 or any other number you have in mind." He pushed his chair back. "You can talk to Rowena Fitch about the rest of it. That's what she's there for." He paid for his coffee and walked back across the street. The next 2 days moved with the particular rhythm of bureaucratic process, not fast, not dramatic, but not without its own kind of tension. Rowena had reached the state land office in Helena and spoken to a senior examiner named Bertram Oakes, who, according to Rowena's account, had spent 20 minutes being cautious and then spent 5 minutes being decisive once she had read him the text of Chester's will in the service receipt aloud over the phone. The provisional flag on Meridian's application was upgraded to a formal hold. Meridian's application could not proceed until the estate question was resolved. Resolution would require a formal hearing before Oakes or his designate. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd day. It was held in the back room of the county administrative building, which turned out to be a room with a conference table and 6 chairs and a window that looked out on the alley behind the building where someone had parked a truck with a cracked windshield. Bertram Oakes appeared by telephone on a speaker unit in the center of the table, a graveled, unhurried voice that gave the impression of a man who had sat through many hearings and found that patience was the most reliable instrument available to him. Grover Hask was there with a briefcase and a second man, who was introduced as Meridian's regional counsel. Rowena Fitch sat across from them with the 2 folders and Chester's will and the service receipt arranged in front of her with the neatness of someone who believes that how you present evidence is itself a form of argument. Eldon sat at the end of the table. Oakes's voice came through the speaker. "We're here to determine the validity of the estate disposition for the Aldgate Parcel Canyon District, Coldwater County, Montana. I've reviewed the documents submitted by the county land office. Mr. Pruitt, I have some questions for you." "Go ahead," Eldon said. The will describes the beneficiary as the man who installed the elevator mechanism in July of 1952. Can you describe that mechanism in sufficient detail to support your claim to be that person? Eldon put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the speaker unit in the center of the table, and he began to describe the Carver Series C7 elevator. He described the brake assembly, the curved iron shoe, the friction drum, the spring mechanism that Chester had had to replace in 1967, the specific corrosion pattern that developed in the release pin when the mechanism was exposed to freeze-thaw cycles over multiple winters. He described the counterweight ratio and why the Series C7 used a different ratio than the Series C6 that preceded it. He described the secondary guide, cable tension specification, 1/8 inch of deflection per foot of run, and the reason for it, which related to the tendency of the primary cable to develop a slight oscillation under load that the guide cable dampened. He described the flaw in the lower sheave housing bearing, raced the microfracture tendency under temperature variation, and the inspection method Doyle Carver had taught him in 1940. A light tap with a copper mallet and listening for the difference between a sound that rang clean and a sound that didn't. He described the specific bolt on the brake assembly crossframe that cross-threaded at 40 foot-pounds because of a casting flaw that Carver had acknowledged in a service bulletin in 1935. And never corrected because correcting it would have required retooling the casting die. And the Series C7 was already being phased out by then. He described the platform surface and the way it felt underfoot when it was loaded, and the sound the primary cable made running through the drum at a walking pace when the mechanism was in proper working order, and the sound it made when it wasn't. When he finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Oakes said, "Meridian's counsel, do you have technical questions for Mr. Pruitt regarding the mechanism?" Hask's legal counsel leaned forward. He asked 2 questions. Basic questions about the counterweight system that any competent engineer could have answered from a textbook. Eldon answered them without effort. The counsel sat back. Hask looked at the table. Oakes said, "I'm satisfied as to the identity question. Mr. Pruitt's knowledge of the mechanism is consistent with installation-level familiarity, not the general knowledge of someone who had examined or researched the system after the fact. Combined with the service receipt bearing his initial and county, the settlement claim and the will, I find that the estate disposition is valid." A pause. Meridian Land Company's application for the Old Gate Canyon parcel is denied. The property transfers to Mr. Eldon Pruitt as sole beneficiary under the Old Gate estate, subject to standard recording fees and the usual statutory waiting period of 30 days. Hask said, "We'll be filing an appeal." "That is your right," Oakes said. "The hold remains in place during any appeal period. Ms. Fitch, please record this determination and forward it to the state office by end of week." "Already drafted," Rowena said. The phone clicked off. Hask looked at Eldon across the table with the expression of a man who had not lost often and was storing the experience carefully. He picked up his briefcase. His counsel picked up his papers. They left without speaking further. Rowena began organizing her folders. She worked with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, a woman who understood that the paperwork was not the end of the thing but the record of it, and the record mattered. 30 days, Eldon said. Standard period. They'll appeal. It may take 6 months, it may take longer. She looked up. But the hold is in place. Nothing happens to that canyon while it's contested. And if they win the appeal, she considered this honestly. They won't. The will is valid, the receipt establishes your identity, and Oakes's determination is on record. An appellate reviewer would have to find a procedural error to overturn it, and there isn't one. She closed the last folder. You should know that Meridian has been buying up mineral rights throughout this district for the last 4 years. This canyon is one of the smaller parcels in their portfolio. It's possible they decide the appeal isn't worth the cost. Eldon nodded. He stood up slowly and straightened his jacket. "Thank you," he said. Rowena Fitch looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has been doing a job for 28 years because the job matters, and occasionally not often gets to see that demonstrated in a way she can point to. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt," she said, "for knowing where to find the service receipt." He walked back through the main street of Coldwater to the hardware store and bought what he needed. Nails roofing tin, a new pane of glass for the cabin window, 2 pounds of dried beans, a sack of cornmeal salt, a tin of coffee, and a coil of steel cable the right gauge for the secondary guide on the elevator. The hardware store owner watched him load it all into the canvas pack he'd brought and didn't ask questions, which Eldon appreciated. He ate a bowl of soup at the diner and started back up the trail at 2 in the afternoon. The trail was easier in the direction he knew it. He stopped at the high point above the shale section and looked back at Coldwater, visible in the valley below, as a cluster of rooftops and the silver grain elevator catching the afternoon light. Then he kept going. He reached the canyon rim as the sun began its last hour above the western peaks. He stood at the edge of the cliff and looked down into the shadow below. He could see the cabin, just the line of the corrugated roof where it met the overhang, the same shadow gray as the rock above it, invisible to anyone who didn't already know to look. He stepped onto the elevator platform and released the brake. He had made this descent before. But the first time he had been a stranger going down into someone else's place, reading the stone walls, the way you read an unfamiliar face. Now the walls knew him, or he knew them well enough that the difference no longer mattered. He did not study the stone layers this time. He watched instead as the canyon floor came into view below him, the dark soil of the raised beds, visible even in the late afternoon shadow, the wire frames he had built along the south wall, catching the last of the angled light. He watched the thread of water emerge from shadow at the base of the cliff, doing its patient work, the same as always, indifferent to what had happened in a conference room 6 miles away. The platform settled onto the canyon floor, and he stood still for a moment, not from ceremony, but because a man should take a breath when he arrives somewhere he intends to stay. He unloaded the pack. He put the food on the shelves in the order he'd need it. He set the cable coil in the lean-to shed beside the tools. He put the glass pane for the window carefully against the wall. He built a fire in the stove. He put water on to heat. Then he took Chester's journal from the low shelf beside the window and carried it to the workbench and sat down. He opened it to the last page, the one with Chester's final entry, and read the 2 lines again. Good canyon, good years. He turned the page to the first blank one. He took the stub of pencil from his shirt pocket and sat for a moment with the pencil in his hand and the blank page in front of him and listened to the canyon settle into evening, the stove beginning to tick with heat, the water moving through the pipe below the floor, the thread of water at the base of the cliff doing its patient work in the dark. He wrote the date, September 1993. He wrote the weather, clear cooling stars visible in the east already above the rim. He wrote the state of the elevator, primary cable sound secondary cable to be replaced this week, brake assembly running well after service. He wrote the state of the garden, beans, staked onions, thinned squash vine, tied back soil, turned and ready for whatever the season had left in it. Then he stopped and looked at what he had written. It was the same shape as Chester's entries, same economy, same attention to the things that could be measured and the things that mattered. He had not planned to write it that way. It had come out that way because it was the right shape for this place, and the place had been teaching him the right shape for 11 days. He wrote about the hearing. He wrote Rowena Fitch's name and what she had done because the record should carry her name, and it would not otherwise. He wrote Grover Hask's name and the number he had offered, and the answer Eldon had given him. He wrote Bertram Oakes's determination as he remembered it as close to verbatim as he could manage. Then he set the pencil down and turned back to the first page of the journal. The entry from September 2nd, 1952. I will try to write every day now. The man from West Virginia left yesterday. I should have asked his name. He sat with that for a while. The fire in the stove had found its rhythm, pushing warmth into the cabin in steady, even pulses. Outside, full dark had reached the canyon floor, and the stars above the rim were sharp and numerous in the way they only get at altitude far from any other light. He thought about Chester Aldgate, who had come to this canyon the same way Eldon had come to it, following a track that went somewhere which was reason enough. Who had stayed because the place was worth staying for, and written it down every day because the days were worth recording, and left everything to a man he'd met for 3 weeks in 1952 and never forgotten. And never found. He thought about what it meant that the journal had started the day Eldon left and ended the year Chester died, and that Eldon had arrived 10 years after that ending and found the pages waiting. Not for anyone. For him specifically. Chester had not known it would be him, but Chester had known it would be someone who could prove themselves by what their hands knew, and he had trusted that the right person would find their way there eventually, and he had been right. He picked up the pencil again. He turned to the page he had just written and added one final line below the record of the hearing and the names and the determination. September 1st, 1952. I left. September 2nd, 1952. He started writing. He was waiting for someone to come back. He didn't know it was me. I didn't know it either. But the elevator did. He closed the journal and held it for a moment. Then he set it back on the low shelf beside the window where the morning light would reach it first. He stepped outside. The canyon at night was a different place than the canyon by day. Not darker in the way that feels like loss, but deeper, like the space had dimensions that daylight kept to itself. The walls were visible against the stars as darker shapes. The garden beds were a row of quiet shadows along the south wall. The thread of water at the base of the cliff kept moving, carrying nothing and going nowhere in particular, and doing it with complete conviction. He stood in the open doorway and looked up at the strip of stars above the canyon rim. They were very bright and very far away, and they had been there the entire time through every season. Chester had recorded through every winter the elevator had survived through the 41 years since a young man from West Virginia had ridden a mine platform up a cliff wall for the last time and walked back to the main grade without looking back. He was 74 years old. He had $4.37 left from the 31 he had started with, which was enough for the next trip to Coldwater and not much more. The cabin needed the window glass, set the east corner of the roof needed 2 more courses of tin before the first snow, and the secondary guide cable on the elevator needed to come out and be replaced with a new coil before hard freeze, which could come any week now at this elevation in Montana. He had things to do. He had a place to do them. He went back inside and sat by the stove, and let the warmth work on his hands and the particular tiredness that a long day puts into a man's shoulders when he has been doing something that mattered. He did not think about Gerald. He did not think about the nursing home in Great Falls or the parking lot outside Gerald's window or the strip mall beyond it. He did not think about Meridian Land Company and their appeal, which would go the way Rowena Fitch said it would go. He thought about the morning. The light coming down the south wall and reaching the garden beds first the way it always did. The pump handle cold in the morning and the water that came up clean and tasted of stone and depth and quiet. The beans along the wire frame pale when he found them filling out now with room and morning light. The secondary cable coiled in the lean-to shed waiting to be run. The window glass leaning against the wall waiting to be set. The roof tin waiting. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the green notebook. Dorothy's notebook with the green cover that he had carried for 3 years and finally opened 11 days ago at the bottom of a canyon in Montana. He opened it to the last entry and looked at what he had written and added one line. "The canyon is good. There are years here yet." He closed it and held it in both hands for a moment. Then he put it back in his shirt pocket against his chest where it had always belonged. Outside, the water kept moving through the dark at the base of the cliff, doing what it had always done, patient and unhurried, and entirely without doubt about where it was going. Eldon Pruitt sat by the stove in a cabin at the bottom of a canyon in Montana and let the fire do its work and did not go anywhere and did not need to.